I'm here today with Michelle Layer Rahal. Michelle is the author of Straining Forward, One Woman's Journey from Oppression to Redemption in the Wake of the Vietnam War. Michelle's a former radio news reporter and published educator. She's a graduate of Hofstra University and holds a Master's of Education degree from the University of New York at Buffalo. Michelle was a contributing editor to The Human Odyssey, Prehistory Through Middle Ages, content editor on The Chalice and the Stirrup Cup, author of articles for Educational Resource Service, and contributing author for various national studies and reports, including the National Indian Education Study. Michelle lives in Virginia with her husband. So Michelle, it's so wonderful to have you with us here today.
Brian, it's a joy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And maybe you could say a little bit more about your background besides that brief overview I gave.
Wow, okay. Well, I went to school for theater, actually. But when I graduated, I thought I really like to write. And somehow I kind of fell into being a newscaster at a radio station. So I started out interviewing a lot of people and found out that I really like asking questions. So I did that for a while, and then I went back to school to become an educator. And I was in the classroom for maybe 7 years when I decided that I really wanted to do more writing. And I got into writing reports and studies for the Virginia Department of Ed, the U.S. Department of Ed. I worked for a consulting company and did various projects with companies around the United States that had to do with education, and wrote articles for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And so I've done a lot of writing in studies and reports. And I wrote my first book in 2018, not planning to write a book, but the story kind of fell into my lap.
Yeah, so tell us, this is the Straining Forward, about a woman from Vietnam. How did that come about?
Well, I wasn't looking to write a book, but I was at church one day when a Vietnamese refugee gave her testimony. And the story shocked me. Having grown up, I was only a child during the Vietnam War, so it didn't affect me directly. But hearing her story, of how her father was shot to death in front of her when she was 11 years old, watching her home burned to the ground, being abused by family members, her mother going into a life of probably prostitution. It was shocking and riveting. And when she was done giving her testimony, I lined up with a number of congregants to say something to her. And I didn't know what I was going to say, but I prayed as I was approaching her. And the very first words that came out of my mouth were, I want to write your story. I thought, oh man, did I just say that?
What did you get yourself into, right?
Myself into, but I've said things before where I thought, I don't know why I'm saying that. And I just take it as a sign from God that that's what he's asking me to do. So for the next 5 years, I would track Min Fung Towner down and ask her, would you like to write your story now? And I go to a relatively large church, 2,000 people. So I didn't always run into her. And about a year after she gave her testimony, she actually enrolled in seminary. So she wasn't always around. But about 5 years after I met her, she was back at the church, and I walked up to her and I said, are you ready to write your story yet? I really think I'm supposed to write it. And she said, well, during prayer, God told me you were. So I guess we should start.
Wow.
So that started a 5-year journey of me interviewing her over Skype and occasionally in person when she would be home from school. And at first, it was a very difficult story to get out of her, because even though she felt that God was saying, this is a story that needs to be written, she was reluctant to tell it in detail. And she kind of gave me bullet points and expected me to just string it all together. But my background in reporting had me asking her questions like, well, how did you feel about that? And in retrospect, how do you see it differently? Or how did you change through that experience? So she really had to do some seeking, deep seeking as to her feelings about situations that she had buried. And speaking of burying stories, she buried a lot of her stories and memories. And it wasn't until I started asking those questions that they surfaced. And
well, that's understandable that that would be difficult for a person to do. I mean, given, your father and siblings murdered and she was tortured and abused and imprisoned. I mean, it's like, oh my goodness.
yes. And yet, when you meet her, she's always smiling. She's always happy. But I've since come to learn that that is a common response for someone with PTSD. It's a way of coping. So we wrote the book over a 5-year period. And during that time, after the first year, which was a struggle to get her to speak, I actually experienced a stroke. So that set us back. And it was during that year of my recovery that Min and I became close as friends. She has a background in nursing. And so she would often inquire as to my health and did I need anything? And out of that friendship grew a trust. And then when we started writing the book again a year later, she was much more accepting of my questions and much more willing to open up.
Wow, what an experience, what a saga to have gone through all of that.
Truly.
So it would have been easy for you to sensationalize, this terrible things and the Vietnam War and all kind of things, which you avoided. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we wanted to keep the story focused on God's redemption. As I said earlier, Min went back to school for seminary to become a chaplain. And so it was very important to her that because she had felt that God was calling her to share her story, that the story would stay focused on God's redemption and not on the horrific events that had occurred throughout her life. I'm sure that if Satan had had his way, we would have focused on those events, but God had his way. And so we focused on God's grace instead.
And I mean, Min, you've told me, doesn't want people to feel sorry for her.
No.
Right, despite having gone through all this horrific background. Is that another natural response to this, or?
You know what, that's a good question. I'm not sure it's natural. I think that response has been born out of her relationship with Christ. She says by feeling sorry for her, it drags her back into the pain, and she prefers to live in the victory. A lot of times when Min and I have spoken before groups or book clubs, meetings, people have said, I thought I had a rough life, but now after I see what you've been through, I don't feel that I have any right to complain. And Min's response is always, oh, you should complain because you should never compare yourself to anyone else. God gives us all different journeys, and whatever we're handed is meant to be a struggle to bring us closer to him. So none of us should compare, but just accept the hardship and find Christ in it and ask for his redemption out of it.
So given this experience that you both had to do this book, I mean, I'm sure it had to kind of affect both of you. How would you say that it changed both Min and you?
A good question. I would say that Min is more open now. She's more free. The book was heavy. There was a lot in her background. And let me just mention, she had been raped multiple times. She was abused by family members. She witnessed the death of her father and siblings. She was left alone as a child to raise her 2 brothers. She was abused by the man who ended up marrying her mother later. She was a boat person and confronted pirates on the South China Sea. I mean, so much. It's hard to imagine that one person endured all of that. And yet she suppressed a lot of it. She was very guarded, and carrying that story because it was so heavy was oppressive. And right before the book got published, she panicked. She was afraid that now that everyone was going to know the truth about who she was, they wouldn't like her. And I thought, where does that come from? But I've since learned that abuse victims often feel that the abuse is partially their fault, if not all their fault. And that was weighing heavily on her. But once the story was out and the response was so overwhelmingly supportive, she has blossomed. I have watched her just blossom. It's like it has freed her by telling her story. And Min has now gone on to enroll in seminary for her doctorate. So she's continuing to work on expanding knowledge. Yeah.
Good for her.
Yeah. And then for me, I think the book changed me in that it's made me more compassionate. I live in my nice little white world. I grew up in upstate New York, just outside of Niagara Falls, on a small farming community. I had never had an Asian or Black or Native American friend. I was very oblivious to the larger world around me. But going into this story with Min made me experience her struggles with her. And it's made me a little bit more compassionate toward people around me. I realize every one of us is carrying some type of burden. And unless we ask, what's your story, we don't know what people are dealing with. So it's opened my eyes to realize that that we need to be more accepting and more inviting from people who don't look like us.
So the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and a lot of Americans for a long time would just as soon forget about the whole thing. So, have you found any reticence in acceptance of the book on that regard? Or, how would you feel that people should relate to it now?
Yeah, well, this story, even though it centers around the Vietnam War, I think there's a lot to be learned from any war, no matter when it took place or on what soil. I think the difference about this book being centered around a war is that it's not a war story. A lot of books that relate to war focus on the generals or the battles. But this is really about the life of a child who lives through war and the effects that a war has on children and what they carry into their adult life. And I think this story should serve as a reminder to anyone who's a politician or works in government that every step should be taken toward peace before you resort to war. And I think for the rest of us, this story is still relevant because it tells us that we can't be complacent. I mean, I think of the book of James 1:27 says, religion that God our fathers accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after widows and orphans in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And I think we are all being called to look after the most weak and vulnerable, and that is often refugees. And this affects our own country right now. And I don't think we should be turning a blind eye. God calls us to become involved, to care for these unfortunate situations and people who are so vulnerable.
Well, we don't know how good we have it in a lot of different ways. There's no question about that. And so I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of the compassionate aspect of this, and that, tragedies live on in multiple serious ways, despite, the fact that that particular war ended, several years ago.
Right.
So the book initially came out in 2018, and now you've just released an audiobook. So tell us about that process. What was that like?
I worked through a company called Findaway Voices, and I did not plan to do an audiobook, but I realized in today's world, there's a lot of people who don't read a paper book. They want audio because they're listening to podcasts, they're commuting, they just want something to listen to. So I didn't even pursue the idea of an audiobook until 2020, which was a great time during the pandemic to be working on a project like that. The hard part of doing the audio is that this particular story moves from Vietnam to France to Australia and then finally to the United States. And so I needed a narrator who could handle all those accents.
Wow.
And though there's not a lot of dialogue in the book, in order to make it authentic, I thought we needed someone who could handle all those. And it took me over 6 months to find someone who was not only good at it, but willing. I worked through Findaway Voices, which was a great company to work with. And they would often send me narrators, and then I would send pieces of the book to them so I could hear their voice. And I would get back from them, I'm not interested in this project. So it was a tough book to find someone, but I have to give a shout out to Karen Gunderson, who was my narrator, and she did an incredible job with all the accents. And I'll put a plug in this month. The audio book can be purchased through Authors Direct for $3.95, which is a steal. So.
Wonderful, wonderful. So this book also has won several indie publishing awards. Talk about what you've won and how that came about.
Okay, well, for indie authors, there are a number of contests that you can submit for, and one of them was the reader's favorite, and I got a silver medal for that for a Christian nonfiction. And there's Indie Excellence Award and the Living Now Award, and I don't have them all in front of me. See, I should have this memorized, and I don't. But they've all been Indie Excellence Awards. They've all been very supportive in that when you apply to an Indie Award and you win one, some of them have award ceremonies. The Reader's Favorite had an award ceremony that coincided with the Miami Book Fair, and that was fun to go to. And others of them will always send out press releases, so you get a lot of buzz when you win or place in an Indie Award contest. And so that was fun. It was fun. It's been rewarding, and I've met a lot of people through those award ceremonies. So if anyone's an indie author, I would highly encourage you to participate in one of the contests.
Excellent. Well, it's really good to hear that the book has gotten such, great reception. Yeah. So what's next, both for you and for Min? What can you talk about in terms of any other future plans?
Yeah, well, Min is currently working on her doctorate, as I said, at Gordon Conwell Seminary, but she's doing that from a distance, and she lives here in the Northern Virginia area and is serving as a chaplain at a local hospital. And I am in the process of writing a second book, which is about the varied and creative ways that God communicates. It's basically a collection of stories and spiritual disciplines to help readers tap into hearing the way God is speaking to them. So that's my next project, is writing a book. I didn't plan to write the first book, and I didn't plan to write this one, but I'm doing it.
Well, good for you. Good for you for, sticking with it. Because, writing a book obviously is a really daunting task and requires a lot of perseverance. So I'm really glad to hear that you've got another, major project in the works.
Thank you. And Brian, you should know this because you just finished this book. I have to tell you, I have to give a shout out to you because reading your book, How to Heal Our Divides. And this really coincides with the message of Straining Forward, is that we really have to care about the people who live around us who don't look like us. And your book is truly inspiring and convicting, and it contains incredible practical steps for individuals and groups that is focused on accepting our neighbor as ourselves, which is what Jesus calls us to do. So thank you for writing this book.
Well, thank you. That was a labor of love myself, no question about that. But I appreciate your support for that. Well, Michelle, it's so wonderful to hear more about the book. Congratulations on doing that and all the success that you've had around that. I really hope that it continues to build in terms of awareness and reception, and that the audiobook goes equally well.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. I hope so too. I'm going to Mississippi in August for the Mississippi Book Fair. So if anyone's in the Mississippi area, come on over to the book tent and meet me. I'd love to shake your hand.
Excellent. Excellent. Good to know. Well, thanks again, Michelle.
Thank you, Brian. This has been a pleasure.